Hello, everyone. My name is Kristian Roberts. I'm the Director of Education at the Dallas Opera. I'm here with my fabulous co-host.
Quo Johnson, Education and Company Culture Manager for the Dallas Opera.
And we're back for another episode of Taking the Stage with Kristian
and Quo.
And today we have a very special guest. I know that I say that about a lot of our guests, but I think people need to understand I just don't have words. You want to talk about speaking in truth and talking about what's real and authentic. Sir, can you just please tell us your name and where you're from and what you do?
Yeah, well, thank you all for having me. I appreciate both of you all in your work, and I've known Kristian and now Quo for a long time in Dallas. My name is Jerry Hawkins. I'm currently the Executive Director of Dallas Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation. It's an initiative of the Kellogg Foundation, part of a 14-place initiative of truth, racial healing, and transformation.
All right. Now, folks, I got to tell you, buckle up, because this is going to be a good one. So I want to talk a little bit about your organization, Jerry, because we've known each other for a long time. We go back when you first came to Dallas, we go back, and you came and brought students to be a part of our educational programming, and just the mentorship and leadership you showed in those particular roles. When I lost track of them for a little while, I was like, what is he doing now? And Quo came and told me, and I was just completely blown away. And I shouldn't have been, because it's Jerry. So I just want to be very clear. Can we talk about what you do in your organization? I know that we could go all day, but can you give us just an overall, I don't want to say your complete mission statement, but just a sort of a general.
Of course. Dallas TRHT is part of W.K. Kellogg Foundation's Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation initiative. This initiative started in 2016 with Kellogg exploring a way that the United States can undergo sort of a TRC, or Truth and Reconciliation Commission, a type of process that has been has started in several countries after that country has went through an ethnic conflict or a civil war of some kind. The most popular one we know is South Africa after Nelson Mandela was elected. South Africa, Black majority, it finally gained some freedom. Nelson Mandela was released after almost 30 years of apartheid, jailing, and came out and became president. And he didn't want his country to go back in civil war. And so he created the Truth and Reconciliation Councils, in which community members can tell their truth and what happened to them, whether they were victim or victimizer, and they could also receive some community forgiveness. Kellogg brought together a bunch of community organizers, scholars, lawyers, folks to create a process that Americans can go through and pilot that process in 14 places, 13 cities in one state, the entire state of Alaska. And Dallas was the last city chosen after the 2016 police shooting to be a pilot city in that work. It started here in Dallas in 2017. And how it works is that Kellogg's gives funding for this work to community foundations in each one of those cities, because community foundations are supposed to be closer to the ground than other philanthropic agencies. Our community foundation, unfortunately, is a large one. They had just started their racial equity work. So the team that was put together at our community foundation of Texas actually separated the work from the foundation, made it very external. I was hired in 2018, and my job was really just to start to learn about the local landscape here. But we did that first by creating a vision and a mission for our work. And so our mission is to create a radically inclusive city by addressing race and racism through the TRHT framework. And that is narrative change, relationship building, and equitable policies and practices. So that's our mission, and our vision is to kind of get rid of that hierarchy of human value that we see that separates what we call a north and south divide in our city, and where there'll be no, no distinguishable ways to separate people and to find out their outcomes through issues of race or racism. So that's really our mission and vision, and we hope to start that work or continue that work. We've already started it.
Absolutely, you have. So I want to bring Quo in on this part of this because, she works with you directly in work that she does. And Quo, over the years, we have, like I said, we have worked with Jerry in different capacities, but I'm kind of put him on the spot and put you on the spot a little bit here too. How is this different? How is this a little different than how we've worked before?
That's a great question. This is different in a lot of different ways. One, Truth, Racial Healing, and Transformation is meant to be a community vehicle to bring about a shared vision of a Dallas without racism. So it's not meant for one specific group, racially, gender-wise, or other. It is meant for the entire community to engage in the work, which means that everybody has a responsibility. It is also meant for us to go through a process. There's like a framework, and the framework starts with narrative change, which is the truth part. According to the TRHC guidebook, you're supposed to start with the truth, right? You have to create spaces in which all communities can share their truth, and a space where we actively combat racist narratives that are in our media, in our entertainment, in our school curricula, that are in monuments and parks, actively and very explicitly attacking and changing those narratives to narratives that are more about loving our cultures, more about celebrating our cultures, and more about people telling their own truths instead of someone talking for you. So it starts with narrative change. And after that narrative change and that truth happens, that true history of what happened to us, then we can start to build relationships with other groups who have some similar, experiences in their history. Just because somebody is now raced as white in this country doesn't mean that their lineage doesn't have a history of strife, particularly in the country. And so it's meant for us to build those relationships with each other. And once we have those relationships, we can start to fight for equitable change through policies and the way that we practice those policies. By the way we see, resources being allocated, by the way that we create neighborhoods that are either affordable or not, that are segregated or not. And so it's really meant to go that way.
Right, that is loaded. That's a huge mission, and that's but it's one that is necessary, and we know that it is necessary in order to progress forward. I want to ask a personal question. What is the reason that you were drawn to this work? I know there are people that would be like, well, the obvious reason is, but we're gonna go with what, because everybody says it's the right. When we talk about this kind of work, it's the right thing to do. Well, we know that, but yeah. What was the thing for you that drew you personally to it?
I think it's a long and a short answer. I think part of the long answer is that my first job ever in history was right out of college, was working for the Chicago Urban League, which was in its origin a civil rights organization. It had transformed into more of an entrepreneurial kind of organization to help Black businesses in Chicago. It was one of the largest national affiliates of the National Urban League. But in there, I kind of learned about some disparities that were happening. I had also learned about this through studies. I had a program called what was that program called? Upward Bound. I was part of Upward Bound. Mm-hmm. My Upward Bound was kind of led by some folks who were Garveyites and folks who were teaching me about like Africa, stuff that I was kind of aware of, but not really intimately connected with. And so that's the first time I started to learn about my culture. And so I knew this stuff was important, and my career kind of progressed in that. But then when I came to Dallas, from living in the South Side of Chicago, where I'm from, I just noticed it just felt different. Even from other places that I had traveled, I noticed a few things. One is that it seemed as though this ahistorical place had been had communities that were like wiped out and replaced by other things.
Yeah.
I noticed that a place that has so much history, like the things I read about in Chicago, like JFK's assassination, I would think there'd be a big national monument to this assassination, and that there'd be a great place of national mourning. And yeah, I see no picture, no statue of JFK nowhere. The museum is not even named after him. And I just noticed this kind of ahistorical feel of it. I was also looking for my community in here. In Chicago, there's like a wealthy strata of people, even on the economic strata of, if I'm looking for Black folks, there's a wealthy Black neighborhood and a poor Black neighborhood. Dallas doesn't have a wealthy Black neighborhood within the city limits. And I was really looking for this big mix of community, and I couldn't find it. The last was really like recorded history. So every city has, every major city, I'm saying like top 10 major cities, has recorded histories of race and its people. Dallas has about 10. Every other major city has thousands of volumes. In Chicago, you can find, hundreds of books on one subject, like the race riots of 1919. You can't find that here. New York, all of these books, right? And I couldn't find those books immediately. And I started to ask questions. And this, when I started to get folks to send me this PDF version of this book called The Accommodation. That was kind of started my journey of learning about Dallas.
That book will do it.
Yeah. And so once that started, I was working at the Wilkinson Center where I met you, and the Embry Family Foundation and the Boone Family Foundation. We're trying to work with Race Forward to bring Facing Race Conference to Dallas. At the time, the Facing Race Conference was one of the largest racial justice conferences, and they had not held one south of the Mason-Dixon line, and Dallas was trying to be the first one. And I remember learning about it, and I was like, I want to be a part of that. And what was happening at the city, they wanted to have it at the city-owned hotel, which is the Omni. It's owned by the city, so it's really kind of ours. If you live in Dallas and you pay taxes, it belongs to you. People don't really know that. But the city said that it wouldn't be profitable, and so they didn't allow it to be held at the Omni, and they moved it to the Hilton Anatole. It sold out the Anatole, and that was kind of the start of kind of me getting involved in that work in Dallas. They held a lot of trainings, a lot of convenings, a lot of focus groups, and I was a part of all of that. And it really started my racial equity journey here in Dallas.
That's fly. I have to say that's a and see, I hate to say, well, that's a great story, because it's not just a story, it's somebody's life.
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing that sticks out the most for me, because you said that, growing up, you had people sort of mentoring you in your young adult age. You had people exploring your history, but how drastic of a change it was when you came to Dallas. And that is not lost on a lot of people who come here and make that observation. And that's not a knock. It just is. It's the truth. It's not the first time I've heard someone say that. Mm-hmm. I'm certain it will not be the last. I know Quo, you've heard people say it as well. So in that, and Quo, I guess I put this question to you because you've actually participated in this work with Jerry. So, and you are a Dallasite, you grew up here, I ask, just in the context of what he said, Is it kind of validating? I mean, sort of validating what you already knew. And what I mean by that is, here's somebody coming from Chicago who comes in and says, wait a minute, something's just not quite sitting right. What does that mean to you?
In that, I don't know if validating is the word per se, but kind of growing up, we all hear different stories, and we all hear stories from our families. We hear stories from our parents. We hear stories from relatives. And so it is so interesting to see how those stories get flushed out once you learn the truth, right? And how those stories kind of coincide with the full narrative, right? We receive part of the narrative kind of in family. And as our families are willing to share different things that they can handle, right? Within whatever trauma, within whatever that is, things that they are willing to share or that they can share, and what that looks like in stark contrast to the things that you learn in school. I'll speak kind of as a Dallasite, but just in anything, right? What city in this nation has told the absolute truth, right? What city in this nation will look and say, we are on stolen land? And this stolen land was built with free labor from stolen people. So it's such a bold, such a necessary perspective, such a necessary medicinal experience, if you will, and that it provides that clarity of what actually happened, in going in and looking and seeking truth, and then looking at the historical context, looking at how that flushes out. So I would say I don't want to say interesting, it's extremely exciting in a way to see what that looks like, to see the truth come out, and then to go about it in a process of, this is the truth and this is what we need to look at, this is what we need to pay attention to, we need to dig deeper, we need to ask more questions, because once again, as we say all the time, it didn't just happen. Things don't just happen. It comes from somewhere. We've inherited this, and we need to know what steps were taken to ensure that this is what continued. And we need to work to dismantle it. But we can't do it until we address the truth. We cannot do it until we address our responsibilities, our different roles, our different positions in the systems that we're in. And we can't do it until we commit to actually going about putting together a change. So I always enjoy, one, having real conversations about it, where it's not so much that you're being dismissed, because that's not the experience of the majority or the dominant culture. But I also love the framework and going through the framework for TRHT, and that there are specific steps and what needs to happen so that they can build upon each other, so that that relationship building happens, and then so that we tackle things so that there's true change.
Let's talk about the steps. Because let's talk about this kind of process. You touched on it a little bit, Jerry, but and Quo just mentions it. So I want to talk about that, because it's a bold move to
tell the truth.
To tell the truth in a society that seems to be bent on alternative facts. And I'll leave it at that. And so when you're tackling something it's deeply embedded into the roots of this country as race, right, to go in and say, we're going to talk about truth, and then use that truth in a process, in a framework, in steps, to move toward healing. A lot of people would say, you know what, that's too much. That's a lot of work to do. That seems daunting. I say this to Quo all the time. People say that's daunting. How on earth do we even begin? So I ask you, and just as much as you'd like to share, what is the process for that? How do you get people in the room and sort of try to get them on the same page about this?
Yeah, I think number one, it's about our humanity, and that these are like human stories. So let me give you a human story, for instance, right? One of the first schools I worked at, because I met Kristian working in after school, was a middle school. It was William Gaston Middle School.
I remember.
And so William Gaston Middle School was interesting because every student that I would see had William Gaston on their t-shirt, right? Or on their uniform shirt. And every adult or admin that worked there also had William Gaston on there. So, you know, me being curious about Dallas and about where I was, I really wanted to just learn about it. I know that cities name schools after people who are local for the most part, unless you know their name, like a real popular person like Booker T, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm like, who is William Gaston? I started to ask the students. Not one student knew who William Gaston was. I asked all of the teachers I encountered. Not one teacher knew who he was. So I asked the admin. I'm talking about vice principals, principals. They didn't know who he was. And that's when I got real concerned with like just the lack of somebody giving me a sentence about him, right? William Gaston turned out to be one of the most important people in Dallas history. Not only is he known as the father of the State Fair of Texas, mm-hmm. where some of my kids attended, you know, some opera classes in the summer, you know what I mean? But gave the city of Dallas land for this first state fair, which happens to be the largest state fair in the country, is very meaningful, you know. He also established the first permanent bank in the city of Dallas. So we're talking about economic force, but he's also a former Confederate soldier. Him and his brothers went off to fight in the Confederate War. Dallas was a Confederate city, mm-hmm. which means that they were really for defending the use of slavery in the South. Right. He came back with one brother. One of the brothers died. That brother who died is memorialized on the Confederate War Memorial outside Dallas City Hall right now. I mean, it's an amazing, true story, you know, that folks should know. Not only that it has ties to like our modern day, because we use the State Fair of Texas every year, and that the ties to the Klan and the ties to mm-hmm. the police and the ties to that are very visceral in our community. But folks should know that history. The book was written by, the book about William Gaston was written by a person who went to my undergrad, Southern Illinois University. So like all of these ties started to just come up, and these are not coincidences, you know what I mean? These are things that we, you know, come about when we're doing this work. You know, you start to find these like straight lines to the work, not crooked lines. Mm-hmm. And what I think that is that once folks start to realize that all of these stories are very intertwined, and that our life stories, regardless of race, are intertwined, that they realize that racism not just hurts people of color, particularly right. Black people, but it hurts everybody. That a city built off of racism and a country built off of racism negatively affects you. It creates fear and anxiety for you. You know, it creates more money for you by segregating communities. You know, it creates a less inclusive economy, which means that things cost more for you. You know, and those are the stories that I think we have to continue to tell for folks to start to understand. And I think that that is a large part of our work.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I say this because, you know, I say that all the time, and you said it in a much more eloquent way than I do. I said, but everybody's gotten duped by this system. Yeah. Everybody got duped. Everybody got duped by it. And it just happens to be that there was a group of people who landed sort of on the privileged side of things. And that's not a knock. That's just saying it affected everybody. And if we're honest, everybody's history got ripped from them. Mm-hmm. It might not have had the same consequences for everybody, but in a lot of ways, I've had people who are a Polish background, you know, tell me that the only thing they know about being Polish is pierogies on Christmas. And
that is a very sad and very, it's a damaging thing. Mm-hmm. That's a big like racial healing conversation I have with white folks, particularly if you have to check their white box. You have to strip your like heritage, you know? You have to like get rid of being Irish or being Polish or being, that's not only just the name. You got to get rid of the language. You got to get rid of the food. You got to get rid of the music. You got to get rid of the rituals and the traditions. Like that's a big stripping, you know what I mean? To become white in America, you know? So it is a damaging thing. And it requires a lot of healing on a lot of our parts, you know?
I would say I have to agree, and I think that's why that's the importance of the work you do, because again, in this context, and I was, you sort of already jumped ahead a little bit, because my next question was going to be about some of the observations that you had in this work, but you had observations before you specifically dove into this work in looking at that middle school.
For sure.
And going, wait a minute, I need to dive a little bit deeper on that. Let me go see what this is about. But I ask you because, and we, and because we know that narratives are reshaped. We very, very often hear the quote that, history is written by the victor.
Right.
In the reshaping of this, and in the talking about the history, how do you go about reshaping the narrative? Like because I know this is a hard pill for some to swallow. When you have to look up and you have to look at a history you were not taught,
right?
Or was kept from you, or you're the person who got taught a history and you never saw yourself in that history,
right?
Except for being enslaved or being pushed off land or anything like that. So, or you're just one little line or one little caption, or your history is an elective in school.
Right.
So how do we reshape the narrative? I mean, how do we go about putting these kinds of changes in place and getting it to the people who make decisions about things like curriculum in school?
Yeah.
And I'm talking from elementary through college.
Right. That is a really good question. And I think it is a very simple answer to start with, but it is a really important start. And that is for us to read and to learn. And I want to say this too, is because I say read and learn because everybody can't read. And that's another really important thing that I'm really learning about, is also access to things. So it may be through arts. That's why arts is so a big part of this work, is that sometimes when people can't read or people don't have access to reading, then art has to take over in that space and create other ways of learning, right? And so when I say read, it's literally like I would have known nothing about Dallas and what had happened here if I didn't have access to reading materials about Dallas. Like I said, it started with people sharing an underground network of the accommodation, literally a legal copy of a book being shared in PDF format in a email via Dropbox link, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Fahrenheit 451-ish, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
But it was a very Black story of Dallas being told by a white man in this very flowery soap opera-ish language. It's beautifully written book, but it also is leaving all these context and nuances out. And I was like, I know some more to the story. And so one of the biggest observations that I found doing this work is that I don't get a lot of pushback because I'm not I haven't written any of these books. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Most of these books are written by white men who have been scholars in Texas or in Dallas, or by newspaper writers such as people in the Dallas Morning News or Dallas Observer or Dallas Examiner, folks who have been doing this work for a long time, and folks haven't just weaved the story together. A lot of the times, and when I talk, I bring the sources. I actually bring the book, or I make a copy of the book, and I make sure that people know this is a real source that I'm quoting from. So when they see a book from 1905 that says, we are taking this land from the natives who have done nothing to develop this land.
Right.
Folks know that is not a Jerry statement. That is a statement of this author who wrote this book and telling exactly why Dallas is on stolen land. You don't have to question it. It's not me. You know what I mean? So that's a big part of the work, is that folks need to know this is not a personal agenda, but our human agenda, our city agenda. That we need to know, the first policy of Dallas, period, was to remove people from this land by any way or force, right? Either remove them by force or kill them. That's it.
Right.
Once folks reckon with that, just sit with that for a minute, reckon with it, and understand that folks have been fighting to get heard. The American Indian group that we work with here, the American Indian Heritage Day folks, so that they have never talked to city officials ever. And they've been around for 30, 40 years. You know what I mean? That type of stuff is crazy, you know? And so me with access, when I'm talking to city staff, which I did, they invited me to talk, but guess who I invited?
Right.
The Heritage Day,
right.
you know? And so they were able to really chastise the city, but also receive some type of relationship with the city as well. Now they have contact. So that's the kind of an example of what I've observed.
And you know what, I hear some things in there, and Quo, if you want to speak on this, I'll just mention it, but I heard you taking an opportunity that you had and then creating a platform for somebody else to get their voice heard.
That's right.
And see,
it's really important. I want to say this because I'm thinking about a really clear example. She shared it with me, and I'm really not just proud of her, but like wishing that she has more support. Marsha Jackson. So we had an event last year. It was called A New Community Vision for Dallas. We held it at the State Fair of Texas at the Briscoe Center. We had over 300 folks in the room, and we were talking about this history and talking about our community visioning work, which is something I want to mention too. But we were able to highlight community stories. And one of those community stories is a story about Shingle Mountain, which is kind of modern day environmental racism of dumping, in which Dallas has continued a legacy of dumping on the Trinity River Basin, right? Where mostly Black and brown people live because they were redlined near the floodplain, near where the Trinity River floods, because it was not desirable land. And Marsha, she bought this land because it's near some space. She has a horse. She wanted to retire there. And the city has allowed this recycling shingle company to dump shingles in her backyard, basically. They have dumped so many shingles that it has become a mountain over 100 something feet tall. It releases particulate that damages her breathing. She has to become an environmental activist in her later years just to get the city to recognize her. The city has already been found guilty of illegal dump or allowing this illegal dumping. They've already been mandated to remove this mountain. It's still standing there. It's still behind her thing. And so she is still trying to bring effort to it. Marsha told me though, recently, because we highlighted her in our program, she has received an award from SMU for Changemaker, and she's received some more community assistance and support, and also more attention. And that is like amazing, you know, that we can share that platform and give her that thing. But it's also, I think, what we all should be doing, because this is wrong. You know what I mean? This lady who worked hard, who is not harming anyone, should not have to become an activist in her later years to live a decent and healthy life, you know?
Just to live, right?
Yeah.
Just to live. Just to live. No, Quo, go ahead. I see you.
and see, and in that, I hear so many things and what it means to use your platform, but what it means to use your platform to step aside so that those who can best tell their stories tell their own stories. And that's something I want to call to specifically the arts, because we're here for opera, but specifically for opera. So often we're like, oh, I need to help you experience culture, or I need to help you tell your story, or I need to help provide you with a voice, because the voiceless. People have a voice. People already have their own culture. I assure you, people already have the ability to tell their own stories. What we have to do is, as we are provided with platforms, as we gain platforms, is to step aside, move aside, so that others can share in that. So much of what we do, because we're so used to the dominant culture, it's all about individualism. It's all about me and what ways can I absorb what you're doing so that I can continue on my path forward. But we have to understand what that means, especially in the arts. when we are wanting to create space for others. We're creating space to share with others, not creating space to dictate where other people fit within our vision.
That's
So
right.
it's so important that we have that narrative change. Again, because so much of what we've learned has been dictated by one voice or one or two voices. And so because of it, we go into a process of simply believing what we've been taught as opposed to asking questions to find out where these beliefs come from or to find out the source of this information. And so often that is what creates so much of a conflict, because it's like, well, no, this is my truth. And it's like, well, this is not true. And this is not true because this is what I learned. This is not true because this is what I experienced. And so I believe it's important that we continue to ask those questions. When we look up and the same type of person has been telling the same story, the same type of person has been composing for years, for centuries, the same type of individuals have been leading organizations, serving on boards, providing funding, right? We just had a recent study that showed that organizations of color receive a lot less funding for the same type of work, that there are disparities in funding according to race. We can talk about gender, but even within gender, there are still disparities according to race, because our nation has an issue with being built on the fallacy of race and racial hierarchy. So I think it's important that as we go through about this and as we look at other people as human beings, like you said, Jerry, it's like, here's a woman who should not have to become an activist in her later years because she just wants to live. And so many of us are in a process of where we just want to live, but so much of it is us having to combat those false narratives just to ask other people to allow us to live lives without, being in danger based on the color of our skin.
That's right.
Well, and just to be seen as human,
right?
Just to be walking in the park. We can't even walk in the park, and I say that because I need people to understand it's humanity.
It's humanity.
The thing is, there comes a time where sometimes you have to understand that there are things that happened in the past, and we've heard the old adage that history, those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. And I'm seeing today, we see history repeating itself, over and over again. And as somebody who is a studier of history, I got to tell you, sometimes I look up and I go, did we learn nothing? And I think that's why it's so important, because we know that the narrative we had that's been shaped, and the stories that we've been told, and for lack of a better word, the lie. Of a lie, it's a lie, it's a fallacy.
Partial truth.
A lot of it, the partial truth is still a lie.
Yep.
You're only telling half of the story. That means another part is getting left out. And so Jerry, I ask, we know that things manifest in the present that come from our past. And you mentioned one of them, the redlining. And you do a lot of presentations where you talk about this kind of thing. Well, and I say this because, we're in the middle of a pandemic right now, but there were things that were going on before the pandemic that have been brought out even more during this pandemic. And they will not go away unless we decide to do something about it during this pandemic, just as we were doing it before. But I think it's even more important now, because you cannot deny the disparity. You cannot, and I could go on, but I'll let you answer the question. But what are some of the ways that you see it manifesting now? I mean, just some of the history that we've been told, or lack thereof, things that we have not been told.
Yeah, so it is manifested in everything that is in the city. There's nothing that exists in Dallas without race playing a part in it. There's nothing. So I can just talk about my neighborhood I live in just as a starter, right? So people really, usually talk about like north of 30, south of 30 disparities. But I live in a north of 30 community. My community is Northwest Dallas. Just so we'll say Northwest Dallas. If I pare down to my community, I live in a community that is probably the most gerrymandered district. And so gerrymandering means separating electoral districts by race.
Right.
I live at the corner of Councilwoman Gates, Councilman Navarez, and Councilman Madrano's. They all touch each other at the corner of Northwest Highway in Lemon. That is gerrymander, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I live in a community called Bachman Lake. It is also separated by airport called Love Field. Love Field used to be partially a Black community. In this community of Love Field, it also used to be the first and only Black golf course. This golf course in this community partially was taken by the city of Dallas by eminent domain. Next to this airport, Love Field, is a Black enclave. It is called Thicket North Park. It used to be a Black freedmen's town, where former folks who were enslaved by folks like the Bachmans and the Marshes and the Knights, people whose streets that we drive on are named after, they settled in this neighborhood in Northwest Dallas. Their descendants are still in this neighborhood. It is still majority Black, even though it's being gentrified on all sides. I mean, that's living history.
Right.
I live next to a Confederate cemetery. It's called Garvey Memorial Cemetery. It's a very small strip of land. You won't see it unless you're looking for it on Northwest Highway in between Midway and Marsh. South of that cemetery is Thicket North Park Cemetery. Hundreds of unmarked graves of formerly enslaved people who are resting right there in land that used to be part of Love Field when it was a naval strip. Like, history all over, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
This city built on that history. Down the street is Cochran Chapel, one of the first United Methodist churches. Next to that is the cemetery where some of these folks, the Knights and the Marshes and the Bachmans, are buried. They are former slave owners. Like, you cannot escape this stuff, you know? And that is just in a less than a 1 mile radius of where I live. If you go anywhere north, south, east, west of the city, more of this history reveals itself to you if you start to dig and read, right? And there's stories for literally every community. South of me is, you know, the neighborhood of Oak Lawn, which used to be Cedar Springs, which was actual city called Cedar Springs, where it was one of the first native settlements because it was a spring, a little like freshwater spring that came out of the ground. They were forced off that land. There were archaeologists that said they found flint and arrowheads on that land, you know? It's so much history. And so I really need to really get back to the question.
No, you're fine.
but the story just takes you there. It's just, it is literally like under our feet, and it really guides us. When I say our city is built off of race, Mark Lamster, who is the architectural critic for Dallas Morning News, wrote in an op-ed recently that Dallas was designed off of white supremacy.
Yes.
And I was elated to read that from a white architectural critic who writes about the buildings of Dallas, to say that this was built off of white supremacy and that we need to recognize that and do something different about that. When folks hear that, I think that they don't really understand what that means. That this city was intentionally designed for segregated activities, that specifically in the city charter from 1931 to 1968, the city said that Black people could not go to certain neighborhoods, that they could not live in certain neighborhoods, and that there has to be a segregation of people by race. And that's that racial binary that was constructed and people talk about, particularly other people of color who are not Black. They kind of talk about the racial binary of why it is always Black and white, and I can't find myself in this conversation. That's because that binary was constructed and reinforced and continues to be developed. That there's this Blackness on the bottom and that this whiteness is on the top, and that everything else is kind of fluid and moves up and down.
Up and down, yep.
So yeah, that is part of the city ethos. Dallas has had all of the things that America has had, right? Native removal, slavery, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, all of those things in a very tiny span. Dallas is only, as a city, about 160 odd years old. And so in this short span of time, it has had all of these things happen. So it's really interesting.
And I guess it is interesting. And I know this is and like I said, this is a hard pill to swallow for some people, because they look at that and they say, well, why can't you just leave the past in the past? You know, why are we not able to move past this? You know, I've heard those questions in the work that I do. I've heard, why are you bringing up the past? You know, why can't we just let bygones be bygones? You know, I'm not a racist. You know, I've heard all these things, and why can't we just let the past be the past?
That's a great question. There is no community organization, there's no institution that doesn't refer to the past in doing its present day and future work. They literally say, this is how we've been doing this for years. And the question for us who have not been included in that work is this the way you want to continue doing that work? Have I been included in that work? Have you had other people included in that work? And what are you losing if you don't?
Right.
What are you losing if you talk about history? What if I introduce you to some of these stories, you know? And so, like, one of the interesting stories that I like to talk about is the story of Deepwood Dump, which is not even a historical story. It just happened in our lifetimes. I'm 40 years old, so it happened in my lifetime. In the 1970s, Pleasant Grove, a neighborhood that, you know, may be famous to some people in the national scene as the, you know, hometown of Bonnie and Clyde, right? Used to be this white neighborhood in South East Dallas. Became, you know, subject to white flight, like a lot of neighborhoods after integration did, where folks started to move out. And then when Black families started to move in because housing stock was scarce, they found themselves subject to really interesting things. In Pleasant Grove, unlike South Dallas was subject to disinvestment and, you know, decline based on city services being pulled out.
Right.
Pleasant Grove found themselves subject to environmental pollution and things being put in. So from 1982 to 2000, the city of Dallas allowed illegal dumping to happen in this neighborhood called Deepwood. These Black folks who can afford to live there in a house that they bought and purchased, probably for more than the purchasing prices. That's another you know, subject we haven't touched, is that they saw the city trying to change the zoning ordinances around this residential neighborhood from residential to commercial because they can get more tax dollars there. Dallas is also a city built on business, not built on the people, it's built on businesses. So it values businesses more than its people. It allowed this company to dump illegal things there, toxic things there for years, so much so that it became the largest illegal dump in Texas history. I would say that, like, everybody knew about it because everybody did. This thing was on fire at least 2 separate times, and the fire could be seen for miles. You know what I mean? The people from the beginning asked the city of Dallas to stop this illegal dumping happening. They went and testified. They went and gave letters to their city council people, and the city of Dallas ignored it. These folks got together, got their finances together, and got a lawyer and sued the city of Dallas and won. The city of Dallas basically had to concede. They had to come up with a plan to change that illegal dump, which had became the worst environmental catastrophe in Texas history, into a landfill. Created a landfill around it, then created a nature preserve on top of it called Trinity River Audubon Center, which I took kids from Gaston and took them on their first canoe ride in the Trinity, ironically. It's one of the first places I took kids. So I'm not saying this stuff is so connected, you know what I mean? I didn't even know that history when I took those kids, but I learned about it later. Because I learned about this beautiful place in Southern Dallas. I'm like, what is this place? This place was a local reparations ordinance. It is free for everybody in zip code 75217.
Yeah.
The next question is, do they know about it? No, they don't. If you go there now, there are white administrators there. You go there, folks are doing, nature walks or bird watching. There's no outreach to the community. There are no sidewalks there, so it's not even accessible to the community. So it is another kind of shame, but it is an example of what happens in a city that doesn't pay attention and doesn't understand its history.
Right.
As a educator who was taking kids there, when the kids were there, they didn't tell us the story about this dumping and why this place was there, and that community members fought for it, and that it was for the community members by city ordinance. They just said it's a great place to take kids and nature preserve. If you learn that history, then you are appalled. I am compelled to do something. I'm compelled to say, like, this is for this community. Y'all need to do better than what y'all do. You know what I mean? So that's an example, and what can happen if we don't. And that's a recent history, right?
Yeah.
That just happened. So what happens when we forget about the other places? Because it's happening in every part of the city, just like that. So.
Yeah, that's why you can't let the past be the past. That answers my question. Well, and I say this too because I know all three of us have probably heard this phrase more than once. Why you keep playing the race card? You're playing the race card, and I know that has to be pushed back in some of the work that you do. I know that in some of the sessions, even when you are presenting facts and you are pulling from historical documents, in the words of people who wrote them during the time or whatever it is, or as evidenced by what you just gave us, concerning one, Miss Marsha Jackson with Shingle Mountain, but also with what goes along the Trinity River with the dumping. I've heard that story. I read it. I didn't know it until about maybe 2 years ago, and my jaw dropped. I was surprised, but I wasn't surprised. You know what I mean? Like it's not surprising. So I have to say, when you get the response, and because I know we all have about the race card, what's the response? And both of you, either one of you can speak on this, because I know we could go on for days about this.
Yeah, so I haven't heard that so much as, why is everything about race? And, I am a very generous sharer of information. If you want to know why everything is about race, I'm going to send it to you. So I am very happy to send people 20 articles because the first part of our work, as detailed in the TRHT guidebook, is to do a community racial history, or this historical analysis of policy in place from indigenous times to present. So the first year, and I was glad I had this time to do that, was to just research, do a deep dive. One of the really advantageous things about Dallas is this is the headquarters of Half Price Books. So we have one of the nation's largest reseller of books here in Dallas. And so there's bookstores all around that are very accessible and cheap. Two is that the Dallas Public Library is very, very open, and the librarians there are really dedicated to historical work and archival work. So there are tons of folks and resources here to help us deal with this history. And so whenever someone has a question, I am grateful to oblige them, If ever a race card can be pulled, I can definitely pull their historical library card, or I can pull a Half Price Books card and help folks out, because the work is there and it's been done by mostly their community,
And then to that, I'd say, because often, again, kind of race is the People are least comfortable with talking about race, right? We'll
Mhm.
default to gender, we'll default to orientation, we'll default to so many things. We do not want to face race because so much of this nation is built on, again, that fallacy of the social construct of race and then that fallacy of a racial hierarchy. So everything is about race because this nation made sure it was about race. Everything is about race because people who were in power, some of the people who are still in power, are ensuring that it is about race, ensuring that those disparities exist because of unconscious and conscious biases, because of false narratives, because of a desire to maintain a sense of supremacy or superiority or normalcy. Not even that.
Status quo. Yeah.
Sometimes it just comes from I'm comfortable and this is what I grew up with and this is how it was and this is how my grandfather said it was supposed to be, and those things. It also comes from the inability to acknowledge what those who came before us have done in a way that is truth. So many people having to face what their great-great-grandparents did, what their grandparents did, what their parents have or have not done, what we have or have not done, the complacency or the action. So often I think of kind of those individuals that we see. Then when we listen to those who went through these type of movements, those who went through these type of experiences, I always wonder, like, where are those people now? Those that are not in our communities, right? Where are those women who were yelling at Ruby Bridges? Where are the kids? And what happens when, as we continue to tell stories, what that looks like, especially if we both have different, not both, but if we all have different narratives. What does that mean when we're leaving out truths? What does that mean when we are refusing to acknowledge the root of the problem? So I always say that it comes down to race in many things, if not most things, because that's the root of the issue. That's the root of the removal of people. That's the root of the dehumanization of people. That is the root of the segregation and the disparities that we experience with people.
Yeah, it's, I have a lot to say on this subject, and I want, for the sake of, we've been in a great amount of time on this, but this is so loaded, and I need people to understand that it is loaded. And when we say that we approach things with grace and respect and love, that doesn't mean we're not going to also approach them with truth.
Oh yeah, always true.
Because you can do truth with grace and love and respect. But the bottom line is that there are things that have gone on in this nation, in this city, in all parts of the world. You just heard Jerry say that this is being done in 14 different cities.
Right.
It's, it came out of and all over the world, South Africa, they're doing this. And there's a reason for it, because it does permeate every single bit of society, whether you want to believe it or not. And I say that as someone who, I do live in this skin, so I can attest to that, and I know all of us have experiences. But I also know a lot of it comes from, we've got a lot of denial, and that, like I said, everybody got duped in some way. And it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate. But what I would say is particularly in the work that I see Jerry do, is the search for truth, and how that is the basis for everything. Yes. And then to move through a process, that's the thing, because we can't get anywhere without that. And that may make people uncomfortable. It may be very hard for people to reconcile things from their past or things from their ancestors' past. It may be very, very difficult. And that is completely understandable. My question is, what's going to happen to make sure it doesn't happen again? Are we gonna keep, are we gonna keep doing this? So I asked you, Jerry, I think my final question to you is you're doing this work. How can other people participate in this work fully and truthfully?
Yeah. Number one, just to find out what we're doing, they can go to dallastrht.org. Our website is something that we're constantly building on. We're putting resources on every week. Currently, we have a COVID-19 resource page where folks can look at articles. They can look at fundraising opportunities or community sharing opportunities. We also have a resource page where there's videos, article links, references. We also have a vision page where they can go and download the reports that we've created. So that's number one, to just find out what we're doing and find out what's happening in the community. Two is they can always Google racial healing or Kellogg Foundation and actually download the work. They can download the implementation guidebook, which is an 80-page guidebook on how to do this work in their communities. And it literally says how to do this work in your community or how to do this work on an individual level. And so they can do that. There's also a racial healing book that they can download and learn about racial healing and how to do racial healing circles. So those three things are huge lifts that it's taken me almost 2 years to put into practice. If 20 folks did that, we would be at a better place. So that's just that, right?
Yeah.
Folks can also start to create spaces to share some of these narratives that we're talking about. Number one, folks have lots of stories just in their families, right? There's an opportunity for us right now to start to get better at archiving some of our family stories, pictures, digitizing pictures, digitizing some stories, obituaries, things like that, that we may have taken for granted that are very powerful to the story of this city. You know, Kristian and Quo story is going to be very powerful when this is all over, of how the opera and how people contextualize Black women working in these spaces. It's going to be very important to the story. People are going to be looking up this story. And I know, it may seem like it's so far away, but it is not. You know what I mean? It is. We're literally, like, when I research stuff and I look up these names, I'm wondering about these people who are doing this work. And I'm like, man, they were doing amazing things. I wish I knew more about them. The most important part we can do is start to archive those stories and start to share them. The Dallas Public Library is also looking for ways to archive work. They're always looking for archival material from like different time periods. And I know that UT Arlington is now archiving COVID-19 related stuff because we're going through a global pandemic, one of the largest ones we faced in our lifetimes. So those are just a few ways. Two is really learning about our local history. As Cole said, Dallas has had all of the history that the United States has had. Folks have talked about it in very strange and weird ways. One of the myths is that Dallas hasn't had a civil rights movement or, any activist movements, which has been furthest from the truth. Dallas has had all of that,
Right.
Folks worked to integrate the State Fair of Texas when they had one day for Black people, so that was activist work that youth did. They were out there on picket lines. You can see pictures of it. We have to do better at telling our stories and creating spaces for folks to learn about them. We need to know, like, when the arts organizations were integrated.
Right.
We don't do justice to those stories.
Right.
I know that there was hard work by people of all colors who worked hard to integrate these spaces. We don't know about them. You know what I mean? We need to learn more about those spaces. I would love to know those stories, particularly as a person who spends my money at these arts institutions, who used to think that the Dallas Opera, or not even Dallas Opera period, was a white thing until I learned about Jesse Norman and Leontine Price, right? And I knew that it was for me, and started spending my money, Nobody has ever asked me to buy a season ticket. I got some money to ask me, you know what I mean? So those types of things I'm really interested in the history of these things and how, I can embrace this artist mind as well, and folks can start to do programming for people like me, right? So those things are really important to me. There are so many ways to participate in this work. All of our large municipalities now have equity offices. And that is a big thing that folks have been fighting for a long time, including myself. Our school district, which is a $1 billion organization, has an office of racial equity. They need a lot of help. They need folks asking questions about what they're doing. They have millions of dollars in their budget, so folks need to find out what they're doing. The city of Dallas has an office of equity. Folks need to know what they're doing. They need to ask questions. I think that the Office of Equity should be presenting race and ethnicity data, COVID-related data. they are not. So we need to be asking questions about this group that is a new group that also has money in their budget. There are folks now who are talking about this work I would have never thought to talk about it. So I would say engage on where your interest level are. Your interest level is. And if you're interested in environmental issues, there are folks working on that. Downwinders at risk. If you're interested in housing, there are folks working on that. Inclusive Communities Project. If you're interested in the arts, there are folks working on that. You know, there are folks right now who need your support and help. And yeah, I would say just, you know, get involved, ask some questions, send us an email at info@dallastrht.org. You know, we're working hard to build some capacity so we can answer all of them, but we will get to it. So yeah.
That's great. I know the thing is that I have nothing left to say after that. There comes a point where you just be quiet, and I think that's our point. Jerry, I want to thank you for being with us today. You know, we always talk about calls to action at the end of this show, and I think Jerry just gave us a list of things that we can do. And I think it's also important to understand that you're not going to be able to do everything, but you can do something.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that now this is the part of the show where I kick it over to Quo and I ask for positive notes. And so Quo, you go ahead and take it away. But I think Jerry has given us some work to do.
Absolutely. Jerry will definitely give us some work to do. Positive notes, kind of for this episode, we spoke very heavily on Dallas, and we know that not everyone who watches this is in Dallas. So I encourage you to take this as an example to learn more about your area, because I assure you there are racial disparities there. I assure you that there are racial disparities within your organization, right? For all of our organizations, for our arts organizations, learn your history. Do the work to find out from where, you know, you're operating, to find out where the organization started, and then reach out to others so that we can learn together. Reach out to others so that we can share our own narratives, right? Create a space where we can share those narratives, and then we can focus on truth. Again, this work is being done. We have Jerry with us who's showing us that the work is being done and that Dallas is one of the 14 locations. That means there are other cities doing this work as well. So do what you can to learn about how these organizations are helping those cities, understand why it was necessary, because it is necessary, and then understand that we'll get through this. As I always say, we'll move through this together. But first, acknowledge truth. Right? Do so with respect, do so with humility, and then acknowledge the truth of others so that we can understand. And again, this is not just coming from out of the blue, right? That there are steps that have been taken to get us here. So let us all begin to take steps to move us forward in a way that is productive, in a way that is healthy, in a way that is healing, and let us do that together.
All right then, and agreed 100%. Jerry, do you have any final thoughts?
Just want to thank you and Quo for having me. You know, thank the Dallas Opera. The Dallas Opera is located in a community that is a formerly Black freedmen's town. And so folks think that, you know, we see this building or we see, you know, this edifice, but it has lots of history, right? It is not just something that was just created and there was nothing before it.
Right.
There were people whose houses were right there on Flora Street, you know what I mean? Who lived extraordinary lives, who had dreams and aspirations. It's really important to make these connections to those people because, you know, their story is also connected to yours. And I'm saying yours, everybody who is visited the Dallas Opera or visited Flora Street or visited the Arts District or who is listening to Quo and Kristian. Those stories are connected, and I hope that we continue to look for those stories and look for those people. They are connected to us, and it'll make us a better community. It'll make us a better people, and hopefully one day, you know, not have to talk about race, you know.
Right.
And enjoy operas and enjoy music without these conversations. And that's the hope.
Fantastic, and I agree. As tough as these conversations can be, as tough as it may be to hear, I assure you that, you know, get nowhere if we continue to ignore things that continue to cause problems. And if we continue to allow systems to be in place that do not serve us. And by us, I mean the whole of us. So I agree 100%. And I want to thank you for being here with us today, Jerry. It was so great to catch up. I want to give a shout out to TDO and TDO Network. Thank you so much for this platform. I appreciate everyone watching. We appreciate you so much tuning in each week. If you have questions, please leave them in the comment section. We want to talk about this. It is vitally important.
Right? If
DM us. You can DM us if you don't want to put your business out in the public. That's fine too. Please feel free to send a private message. Jerry just told you how you can get a hold of his organization. We'll make sure to drop a link there as well. But understand that, you know, it's time. And if we can talk about it now during a time such as this, then there's no reason why we can't talk about it and fix it, you know, in the time after this. But it's important that we do talk about it and work toward a like Quo says all the time, a healing, you know, healing and in a healthy way. So thank everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks.